I was 12 the first time I saw the body move inside its coffin. The faintest shift of a hand brushing against velvet as if it wanted out. My family runs a funeral home deep in the Appalachian Mountains, and to most people, that sounds quiet, maybe even boring. But we don't just bury the dead. We follow 9 strange rules, rules that have been passed down for generations, rules that decide who gets to stay underground and who doesn't. I remember the first time I broke one, and the thing in the basement reminded me why the rules exist. What I saw that night still keeps me awake, because I'm not sure it ever went back to sleep. The first thing my father ever drilled into me, when I was old enough to help around the funeral home, was Rule 1. Never touch the body after midnight. At 12 years old, I thought it was a superstition, just one of those strange traditions families make up to scare kids into behaving. The embalming room smelled of chemicals and old wood, and I remember standing beside him as he lit a lantern instead of turning on the overhead bulbs. He whispered that some rules weren't meant to be explained, only obeyed, and I remember shivering though the room wasn't cold. That was the night I realized our home wasn't like other homes. I'd sneak downstairs sometimes, curious about what exactly he meant. Midnight never seemed any different to me. The air didn't shift, and no thunder clapped outside to mark the hour. But my father's face, whenever he caught me lingering near the parlor too late, told me that something real waited behind that rule. His eyes would dart toward the coffins, then back to me, and he'd mutter under his breath about foolish children who wanted to learn the hard way. The more he tried to keep me away from it, the more the rule grew inside my head, like a riddle I had to solve. It was a stormy evening in late October when I tested the boundaries of Rule 1 for the first time. A family had dropped off a closed casket for us to prepare, claiming they couldn't bear to look at their son again. The storm outside rattled the shutters, and I sat upstairs listening to the wind until I couldn't help myself. Slipping out of bed, I padded down the narrow staircase, careful to avoid the third step that always groaned. The grandfather clock in the hallway told me it was 20 minutes past midnight when I pushed open the embalming room door. The lantern still flickered on the counter, casting long shadows across the walls. The coffin sat in the center, lid partially open, and curiosity pushed me closer. The boy inside couldn't have been older than 16. His skin pale and waxy beneath the dim glow. My father's tools were laid neatly beside him, but I wasn't paying attention to the instruments. My eyes stayed on the boy's hands, folded neatly across his chest. I don't know why I reached out, maybe to prove to myself that the rule was nonsense. My fingers hovered just above his wrist when the lantern's flame sputtered violently, and the air turned thick, almost heavy enough to choke on. I froze, my fingertips brushing against skin that should have been ice cold. But it wasn't. It felt faintly warm, as if blood still ran beneath it. My breath caught in my throat, and I jerked my hand back instantly, knocking over a small metal tray that clattered against the floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in that still room, and when I looked back at the body, the boy's lips were parted just slightly, as though he'd tried to take a breath. I stumbled backward, heart pounding, and slammed into the doorframe before sprinting upstairs without even shutting the lantern off. The next morning, my father didn't ask if I'd gone down there. He simply looked at the overturned tray, then at me, and his jaw tightened in silent anger. "You touched him, didn't you?" he asked in a low voice, though I never admitted it out loud. He didn't need me to. He warned me that if I ever ignored Rule 1 again, I wouldn't just put myself at risk, but all of us under this roof. His tone wasn't angry anymore. It was frightened, like he knew something I couldn't possibly understand. I swore I'd never try again, but deep down, I knew curiosity would claw at me until it broke me open. That promise lasted until I turned 16, the same age as the boy in the coffin. My father trusted me with more responsibilities then, cleaning the parlor, guiding grieving families, even preparing the rooms for viewings. I felt older, stronger, almost untouchable. Rules that had once felt sacred began to sound more like stories meant to control me. That year, One of my classmates died in a car wreck, and her family brought her to us for the service. Seeing someone I knew lying in a coffin was unsettling enough, but hearing her name whispered in the halls of school the next day made it unbearable. I wanted to know if she was still in there, if she could hear us, if maybe she could even move. So I waited until the night after her arrival, creeping downstairs when the house was asleep. Midnight came and went. As I sat in the embalming room, staring at the girl's pale face, I told myself that nothing would happen, that my father's stories were just warnings to keep me obedient. I reached out again, this time with more confidence, and pressed my fingertips gently against her hand. The warmth that spread through me wasn't natural, not like human heat. It felt more like the slow burn of coals beneath skin, steady and alive. My stomach twisted, and before I could pull back, her eyelids fluttered once, like a dreamer stirring from sleep. I yanked my hand away and stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair behind me. My chest heaved with panic as her lips parted, just enough to release the faintest sound, almost like a sigh. I couldn't bring myself to move, couldn't bring myself to scream. I just stood frozen until her face settled back into stillness, as if nothing had happened. The room felt colder now, the lantern dimmer, and I finally forced myself to back out and shut the door. That night, I lay awake listening for footsteps in the hallway, half expecting her to come find me. My father noticed the change immediately. The next morning, he looked at me the way he had when I was 12, but this time there was no anger at all, only dread. "You felt it, didn't you?" he asked, voice low enough that my mother and brother couldn't hear. I wanted to deny it, to pretend it was my imagination, but I couldn't lie to the terror etched into his face. He gripped my shoulders tightly and said, "The dead don't always stay where we put them. That's why we have rules." He said Rule 1 again, firmly, as if repeating it could undo what I'd done. That evening, my brother whispered through the wall between our rooms, asking if I'd noticed the coffin lid looked slightly different, as though it had been moved during the night. I told him he was imagining things, but I didn't sleep at all after that. I lay in the dark, listening to every shift of the old house, wondering if one of those sounds wasn't the house at all. The next day, when I went to check on the girl's body, I swore her lips were a shade less blue, her hands folded in a slightly different position. My father pulled me out of the room quickly and locked the door, telling me we would not open it again until the burial. For days after, I felt her presence everywhere. At school, whispers seemed to follow me in the hallways, though no one was near. At night, I woke to the faintest pressure at the foot of my bed, like someone had just been sitting there waiting for me to stir. I told myself it was my imagination, but when my brother asked if I'd been wandering the halls at night, my stomach dropped. He said he'd seen a figure standing in the parlor long after we were all supposed to be asleep. But when he called my name, the figure didn't turn. On the morning of her burial, I begged my father to close the casket without a final viewing, but the family insisted. They wanted one last moment with their daughter, and I had no choice but to stand at the back of the room as they filed in. My stomach churned as her mother leaned over the body, brushing her daughter's cheek with trembling fingers. Nothing happened then, not in front of them. But when the family finally left and the room emptied, I stood frozen as I saw the girl's lips curl into the faintest, almost imperceptible smile. I blinked hard, telling myself it was the light, but the memory has haunted me ever since. That was the last time I ever touched a body after midnight. The fear my father carried wasn't just old superstition. It was knowledge, carved into our bloodline, knowledge I had been too stubborn to respect. Rule 1 became more than a whispered warning after that. It was burned into me, a rule I would never break again. But sometimes, late at night, when I lie awake, I wonder if breaking it once was enough, because ever since then, I hear faint movements in the embalming room when the clock strikes 12, and I know that one night, those movements will make their way upstairs. My father was obsessive about Rule 2. Always cover the mirrors before sunset. Every evening, just before the last streaks of daylight disappeared behind the ridges of the mountains. He'd walk through the funeral home with a heavy roll of black cloth. He would drape it over every mirror, every reflective surface, even the glass panes of cabinet doors. At first I thought it was just another one of his eerie traditions, something passed down without reason. But after what I'd seen when I broke Rule 1, I stopped laughing at those strange habits and started watching more carefully. There were mirrors in almost every room of the old house, framed in dark walnut and spotted with age. Some were cracked from decades of use, and others so warped they made your reflection ripple when you moved. I used to stare at myself in them as a child, making faces and watching the glass mimic me. But after my father's warnings, I began to notice how the reflections sometimes lagged, just a fraction of a second behind me. It was subtle, so subtle that I told myself it was a trick of the light. Still, every time the sun dipped lower, the reflections seemed more eager, as though they were waiting for him to forget. One evening, he sent me to cover the parlor mirror while he handled a delivery in the embalming room. The coffin had arrived late, and sunset was bleeding through the trees faster than I expected. I grabbed the cloth and hurried into the parlor, but as I lifted the fabric, I hesitated. The mirror in that room was tall and ornate, nearly reaching the ceiling, its frame carved with twisting vines. The reflection showed the whole space in perfect detail, the empty chairs, the polished floor, and me standing awkwardly with a bundle of cloth. But then, as I stared longer, I noticed a figure seated in one of the chairs. My chest tightened because the chair itself was empty, yet in the glass it wasn't. The figure was faint, a shadowy blur at first, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. A woman sat there, dressed in black lace, her face pale and waxy like the bodies I'd seen laid out for viewing. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and her head tilted slightly, as though she were listening to something I couldn't hear. I dropped the cloth in panic and stumbled backward, my eyes never leaving the glass. The woman's lips moved silently in the reflection, but no sound reached me. I scrambled to grab the cloth and threw it over the mirror, hands trembling as I tucked it along the edges. The room instantly felt lighter, the air less suffocating, but I couldn't shake the image of her face. When my father returned moments later, he saw the sweat on my forehead and the way I wouldn't look toward the mirror. He didn't scold me. He just put a heavy hand on my shoulder and said, "That's why we keep them covered. The mirrors aren't just glass, they're doors, and some doors don't close if you look too long." His voice carried the same dread it had when he warned me about Rule 1, but this time I didn't dare question him. From then on, I joined him every evening in the ritual of covering the mirrors. My brother grumbled about it, saying it was a waste of time, just another way our father kept us trapped in his rules. He joked that maybe the dead just wanted a better look at themselves before they went under the ground. I laughed nervously when he said it, but the unease in my stomach wouldn't let me fully agree. My brother didn't see what I saw in that parlor mirror, and I prayed he never would. Still, I worried his doubt would push him to test the rule, just like I had with the first one. It didn't take long for that worry to come true. One evening, when my father was called out to help a grieving family, he left us in charge of preparing the house. I covered the kitchen and hallway mirrors, but when I walked into the sitting room, the large wall mirror was bare. My brother leaned casually against the frame, smirking at me. "Nothing's happening," he said, his reflection grinning back at him a second too late. I told him to move so I could cover it, but he shook his head. "You're letting him scare you. It's just glass." The sun had already dipped low, and the room was drenched in a strange orange glow. I wanted to rip the cloth from his hands and throw it over the mirror myself, but something stopped me. The reflection caught my eye, and I realized my brother wasn't alone in it. A figure stood just behind him, tall and thin, its face a blur of shadow. My breath caught in my throat as the figure leaned closer in the reflection, its head almost brushing his shoulder, but in the real room there was nothing. I shouted for him to step away, my voice shaking, but he only laughed and said I was worse than Dad. "See," he said, pressing his palm against the glass. "Just a mirror." The moment his hand touched it, the reflection didn't follow. His real hand pressed flat against the surface, but in the glass, his reflection's arm hung limp at his side. My stomach turned cold as I saw the reflection's mouth twist into a wide, unnatural grin. My brother's laugh faltered, his eyes darting between his hand and the glass. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I yanked him back so hard he nearly fell, and the cloth dropped over the mirror just as the last sliver of sunlight vanished. The room went silent, heavy with the kind of quiet that felt alive. We didn't tell my father right away, but I think he knew something happened. He looked at us both that night, his expression grim, and reminded us that Rule 2 wasn't negotiable. He told us stories of neighbors who ignored it years ago, families who claimed their reflections began moving differently, whispering to them from the glass. Some swore the reflections stepped out, replacing them, leaving their real bodies trapped behind the mirror. I wanted to dismiss it as another attempt to frighten us into obedience, but after seeing the grin on my brother's reflection, I couldn't doubt anymore. That night, long after everyone went to bed, I lay awake listening. The house was quiet except for the faint groan of the old beams settling in the wind. I told myself everything was fine, that the mirrors were covered, that nothing could slip through, but just before I drifted into sleep, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't footsteps, not exactly. It was the faint scrape of a fingernail dragging slowly across glass, coming from the sitting room where the uncovered mirror had stood. If there's one thing my father feared even more than the mirrors, it was Rule 3. Do not answer the door after midnight, no matter who is knocking. He never said why, never explained what could possibly stand on the other side of the heavy oak doors after that hour. But I knew from the way his hands trembled while bolting the locks that it wasn't burglars or drunk neighbors he was worried about. His warnings always carried the same weight as the silence that hung in the embalming room, a silence that seemed to be waiting for something. The first time I ever heard it for myself, I was 15. The house was quiet, my parents asleep, my brother snoring in the room across the hall. I had just started to drift when the sound came, slow and deliberate, echoing faintly through the long hallway. Someone was at the front door. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then came another knock, and another steady, unhurried, like whoever stood there had all the time in the world. I pulled the covers over my head, heart pounding, but the knocks kept coming, as patient as a heartbeat. I wanted to wake my father, but I was too afraid to move. The funeral home was built of old wood, and at night every creak and sigh seemed louder than it should have been. The knocking didn't stop, and after what felt like hours, I realized it wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, almost like a pattern, deliberate and steady. Then came the voice. Soft at first, then clearer, a woman's voice calling my name, not shouting, not pleading, just calmly speaking it, over and over. My blood turned to ice, because she spoke in the same tone my mother used to call me to dinner. I gripped the sheets tighter, pressing my face into the pillow, trying to block it out, but the voice didn't fade. Instead, it grew more convincing, more familiar. She began saying things only my mother could know, phrases she used, little jokes, even humming the lullaby she used to sing when I was small. The rational part of me screamed that my mother was asleep in the room down the hall, but the sound was so perfect, so exact, that I almost believed she was standing outside in the cold. I didn't move, not even when the knocks grew louder, sharper, the rhythm still impossibly steady. When morning came, I rushed to the door, half expecting to see scratches or signs of someone trying to get in. But the wood was untouched, the bolts still locked tight. My father was already there, his face pale, his eyes heavy with the kind of exhaustion that comes from staying awake all night. He didn't ask if I heard it, he only nodded, like he knew exactly what had happened. "That's why we keep Rule 3, he said quietly. "It doesn't matter what voice you hear, or what it promises, if you answer, it comes inside." His words sank into me like ice water, and for once I didn't need more explanation. But my brother didn't share that fear. He thought it was all a scare tactic, just another way to keep us in line. He teased me relentlessly after I told him about the voice, mocking me for hiding under my blankets like a child. He said he'd prove the rule was nonsense, that next time the knocking came, he'd open the door himself. I begged him not to, but he laughed it off, the way he always did. His skepticism was like a second skin, and no story could ever peel it away. I prayed the knocking wouldn't come back, but deep down, I knew it would. It did 3 nights later. This time both of us were awake, whispering back and forth in the dark. When the first knock sounded, he grinned at me through the gloom, as though daring me to stop him. The knocks came again, louder now, and I heard the same voice as before, calm and familiar, calling my name. But then, to my horror, it shifted. The voice began saying my brother's name instead, with the same gentle inflection, the same exact sound of our mother's tone. His grin faltered, but he still swung his legs out of bed. I grabbed his arm, whispering frantically for him to stop, but he shook me off. "It's nothing," he said under his breath. "You'll see." He crept toward the stairs, and I followed, my chest so tight I could barely breathe. The knocking was louder now, echoing through the house, deliberate and demanding. By the time we reached the foyer, the voice was pleading softly, asking him to let her in, telling him she was cold. His hand hovered over the bolt, and I thought I was going to be sick. His fingers brushed the metal latch, and for a split second, I swore I saw the shadows beneath the door ripple, as though something pressed against the wood. I threw myself at him, pulling him back so hard we both fell to the floor. He cursed at me, struggling to shove me off, but before he could stand, a new sound joined the knocking, a low guttural scrape, like claws dragging along the outside of the door. My brother froze, eyes wide, as the sound circled the porch, slow and deliberate. The voice grew harsher then, no longer soft, no longer gentle. It called his name again, but this time it didn't sound like our mother. It was deeper, broken, like several voices layered over each other. My brother went pale as ash. We stayed on the floor, clutching each other, until the sounds faded with the first hint of dawn. When we finally dared to look at the door, I saw deep gouges carved into the wood, long and jagged, as though something had dragged nails or worse across it all night. My father found us sitting there, and when he saw the marks, his face went white. He didn't shout, didn't scold, he just stared at my brother with a look of raw fear. "It almost had you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Do you understand now why Rule 3 matters?" My brother only nodded, too shaken to speak, but that night changed him. He stopped laughing at the rules, stopped teasing me about being scared. Still, I could see the way his eyes lingered on the door every evening, as though he half expected the knocking to return. And maybe that's why it was worse when it finally did, because this time, it wasn't calling for either of us. The voice was different, softer, higher pitched. It was calling for my mother. My father always insisted on lanterns. He claimed electric light was too fragile, too unreliable in a house like ours. Every evening, just as the sun sank behind the ridges, he lit a line of heavy brass lanterns filled with thick oil that gave off a steady flickering glow. Their soft flames stretched shadows across the walls, making the old house look alive. He told us over and over that Rule 4, never leave the lanterns unlit. After dark was one of the most important rules of all. The dark isn't empty, he would say. It notices when it has room to grow. I used to think he was just being old-fashioned, clinging to outdated traditions in a modern world. But then again, I thought the same about Rule 1 and Rule 2 until I broke them. The lanterns gave the place a strange kind of safety, their glow chasing back corners that might otherwise swallow you whole. My brother and I joked about it sometimes, daring each other to walk through the halls without a lantern, but neither of us ever did. Even before I understood, I felt the weight of the darkness pressing in, waiting. The first time I saw what happened when a lantern went out, it was an accident. A storm had rolled in from the mountains, thunder rattling the glass panes while rain hammered the roof. One by one, the lanterns flickered but held their light, except for the one in the embalming room. Its flames sputtered against the gusts of wind that slipped in through the cracks, and before I could relight it, the flame vanished into smoke. The room plunged into a thick, unnatural darkness that swallowed even the faint light from the hallway. I froze in the doorway, unable to step inside. The blackness wasn't like ordinary shadow. It seemed to shift and writhe, like smoke twisting in a slow, deliberate dance. I blinked, certain it was my eyes adjusting. But then I saw it. Something moved inside the dark. Not a shape exactly, more like the suggestion of one, limbs too long, a head that tilted with unnatural slowness. I heard a faint dragging sound, as though feet were shuffling across the wooden floor, but I couldn't see them. My stomach twisted, and every instinct screamed at me to back away. I fumbled with the matchbox, striking a flame with shaking hands. The instant the lantern relit, the room was empty again. The tools lay neatly on the counter, the coffin sat untouched, and the air smelled only of oil and wood. But I knew what I'd seen, even if the light had erased it. My father arrived moments later, rain dripping from his hat, and his expression turned grave when he saw the newly lit lantern. He didn't need to ask. "That's why Rule 4 is never broken," he said, voice sharp with fear. "The dark isn't meant to be invited." After that, I took the lanterns more seriously. My brother, however, didn't, not at first. He teased me for how pale I'd gone, saying storms made me jumpy, that I was letting shadows get in my head. But I noticed the way his eyes flicked nervously toward the windows when the wind blew too hard, or how he lingered near the lanterns longer than before. He'd never admit it, but I think he believed me more than he wanted to. Still, his stubbornness made him reckless, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he tested the rule himself. That time came on a bitter winter night when snow blanketed the mountains. The house was quieter than usual, muffled under the weight of the storm outside. My father had gone to bed early, and it was up to us to check the lanterns. I made my rounds carefully, covering every corner with steady flames. But when I reached the hallway outside the parlor, I found one lantern dark. The wick was cut clean, too deliberate to have been an accident. My stomach dropped, and I realized immediately what had happened. My brother stood at the far end of the hallway, smirking. "Nothing's there," he whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the dim space. "You're too scared of shadows." His words carried bravado, but I saw his hands trembling at his sides. The hallway stretched between us, the lanterns flickering weakly, their light failing to push back the thickening dark at the center. I wanted to scream at him, to beg him to relight it, but before I could move, the shadows began to swell. They pooled outward from the extinguished lantern, seeping along the floor like ink spreading in water, and then the sound came. Soft, scraping, uneven footsteps, moving closer. My brother's smirk faltered, his eyes widening as the air turned cold. We both heard it, a faint, wet breathing that came from the spreading dark. I ran toward the nearest lantern, yanking it from the hook and holding it high. Its glow pushed the shadows back, but only just. The darkness recoiled, folding in on itself, but not before I glimpsed something inside it. A face, if you could call it that, hollow sockets where eyes should have been, a jaw that stretched too wide, teeth glinting like shards of glass. It vanished as the light reached it, leaving only the echo of its breath behind. We didn't sleep that night. My brother didn't speak a word, and I didn't press him. When morning came, the snow outside was piled high, sealing the roads. My father found the cut wick and didn't ask who did it. He only said, "This house remembers who disrespects it." The way he looked at my brother made my stomach twist, because I realized then that our father wasn't just protecting us from the house, he was protecting the house from us. Rule 4 wasn't just about survival, it was about keeping the darkness from remembering our names. But the darkness did remember. That night, long after we had relit every lantern, I woke to the sound of breathing, not my brother's, not my parents'. It came from the corner of my room, where the lantern flame burned low. I forced myself to turn my head, and in the weak light, I saw the faintest ripple of shadow stretching toward my bed. I scrambled up, relighting the flame quickly, and the shadow shrank back into nothing. But my hands were shaking too hard to hold the match steady, and for a split second, I thought the dark might win. Since then, I've been terrified of what might happen if even one lantern is forgotten. We've all become more diligent, checking and rechecking each flame every night. Still, sometimes I wake with the sense that something is watching from the corners, waiting for the wick to burn out. I know what I saw in that hallway, and I know the dark doesn't forget easily. My brother avoids talking about it, but I see the guilt written on his face every evening when he helps light the lanterns, and though he hasn't said it aloud, I think he knows what I do, that we didn't chase it away that night. We only pushed it back, and now as I sit here writing this, I can smell smoke faintly in the air, though all the lanterns are burning steady. My chest tightens, because if every flame is lit, then the smoke isn't from the lanterns. It's coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the house, carried on a breath that doesn't belong to any of us. The bells were never supposed to ring. At least, that's what I thought growing up in the funeral home. We didn't have a chapel with tower bells, and no one in our family played any instruments. Yet every so often, deep in the dead of night, I would hear the faintest chime drifting through the halls. At first, I thought it was the wind whistling through the pipes, or maybe the settling of the old beams. But my father's face hardened when I told him. That was when he repeated Rule 5. Never follow the bells after midnight. The first time I heard them clearly, I was 13. A single tone, soft and low, like a church bell being struck miles away. It rang once, then again, the sound curling through the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it came from. I remember stepping out of bed, my bare feet cold on the wood floor, and feeling like I was being pulled toward it. The chime was almost gentle, almost comforting, like something calling me by name without words. That was when my father grabbed my shoulder. He yanked me back into my room and slammed the door shut, his hand trembling as he whispered harshly, "You never walked toward them. Do you understand?" I nodded, but part of me wanted to ask why. He didn't explain. He never did. Instead, he sat in the chair by my bed all night, lantern glowing weakly beside him, while the bells tolled a slow rhythm that only I seemed to hear. By morning they were gone, and my father left without another word. That was the first time I realized the rules weren't meant to be questioned. Still, curiosity is a dangerous thing, especially when paired with youth. I couldn't stop thinking about the sound, about how it reached inside me in a way nothing else ever had. It wasn't like the whispers I'd sometimes heard near the coffins or the shadows that clung to the corners. The bells carried a promise of peace, maybe, or of answers to questions I didn't even know I had. For years I wondered what would happen if I followed them, and for years my father's warning was the only thing that held me back. It wasn't until my brother broke Rule 5 that I found out. He'd grown reckless after what happened with Rule 4, desperate to prove that the house couldn't control him. I woke one winter night to the faint tolling of bells, softer than ever before. This time I wasn't the one who left my bed. I heard the creak of footsteps in the hall, the slow shuffle of my brother being drawn to the sound. By the time I slipped out of my room, he was already halfway down the corridor, moving as if in a trance. I whispered his name, but he didn't answer. His eyes were glassy, fixed ahead, his lips parted as though he were listening to a lullaby no one else could hear. The bells tolled again, and I felt the pull too, faint but insistent, like invisible threads tugging me forward. My hands shook as I tried to reach him, but every step closer made the sound grow louder, and with it, an ache bloomed behind my eyes. It wasn't just noise anymore, it was pressure, filling my skull until it felt like my thoughts weren't my own. I stumbled back, clutching my head, and that was enough to break whatever hold the bells had on me. My brother didn't stop. He walked straight through the heavy oak door at the far end of the hallway, a door that should have been locked. The moment it shut behind him, the bells cut off, leaving the silence so thick it rang in my ears. I stood there trembling, unable to move, afraid that opening the door would mean hearing that sound again. And I knew deep down that if I heard it any longer, I might not come back. It was my father who found him hours later, standing in the embalming room with his hands pressed to his ears. His skin was pale, his lips moving in whispers I couldn't hear. When my father touched his shoulder, my brother collapsed to the floor, unconscious. He woke the next day with no memory of what happened, only blood trickling from his ears and a hollow look in his eyes. My father said nothing, but the way he barred that hallway door afterward told me enough. Whatever was behind it, the bells were its invitation. I've tried to piece it together in the years since. The funeral home is older than our family's claim to it. Records mention tunnels beneath the foundation, sealed off generations ago. Some say the house was built on top of a churchyard, others that it replaced a monastery that burned down. Whatever the truth, I think the bells belong to something buried deep beneath us, something that wants out, and if you follow them, you give it permission to pull you closer. My brother gave it that permission, and sometimes I see him twitch when the air is too still, as though he still hears them faintly. 2 nights ago, the bells returned, louder than ever before. I was lying in bed, lantern glowing, when the first toll vibrated through the walls. This time I didn't move. I pressed my hands against my ears, humming to drown it out, but the sound seeped through my bones. My brother stood in the hall again, swaying on his feet, his face slack. I called out to him, begging him to stop, but he only whispered, "They're waiting." His voice didn't sound like his own. It was deeper, older, and it chilled me to the marrow. The bells tolled again, and for the briefest moment, I thought I heard voices layered inside them, hundreds of whispers, rising and falling in a terrible harmony. They weren't calling my name this time, they were calling his. My father appeared suddenly, lantern in hand, his face more furious than I'd ever seen. He struck my brother across the face, hard enough to drop him to the floor, breaking the trance. The bells cut off mid-ring, leaving behind only the ragged sound of my brother's breathing. My father stared at me then, his eyes full of unspoken fear, and whispered, "You can never follow them. Not ever." Now I sit awake at night, lantern burning, waiting for the bells to come again, because I know they will. They always do. And next time, I don't think my father's hand will be enough to break whatever spell they weave. Sometimes when the house is silent, and the mountains hold their breath, I can still feel the vibration in my chest, a low hum like the memory of sound. I'm terrified of what might happen when the bells stop asking us to follow and start demanding it. It sounds obvious, doesn't it? A coffin is meant to stay shut once the body is placed inside, a symbol of final rest. But in our funeral home, it's more than symbolism. It's survival. My father drilled it into me early. Rule 6, never open a coffin after dusk. He never explained why. Not in full, but I'd seen enough strange things to accept it. At least I did until the night I let curiosity win, and I learned why that rule mattered more than most. I was 16 when it happened. We had received a body from a small mining town a few ridges over. The man had died in a cave-in, crushed under beams and stone. I remember the way his face looked when they wheeled him in, bruised and swollen but almost peaceful, as if the mountain had claimed him gently. My father prepared the body during the day, his hands steady, his face unreadable. By the time the coffin was sealed, the sun was already dipping behind the peaks. That's when he warned me again. Not after dark, not ever. The coffin sat in the viewing room that night, waiting for the service scheduled the next morning. I had gone in to set fresh candles and make sure the chairs were arranged properly. That was when I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind shifting through the cracks of the old house. A faint, dragging sound, like cloth sliding against wood. Then came a muffled thump, slow and deliberate, from inside the coffin. My whole body went cold. I froze where I stood, candle flickering in my hand, heart pounding so loud I thought it would wake the dead. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, but then it came again, a heavy knock, once, then silence. My hand tightened on the candle, wax spilling onto my fingers, burning hot. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to slam the viewing room door and run upstairs. But there was another voice inside me, smaller, whispering, "What if he's still alive? What if they made a mistake?" That whisper drowned out the fear. Against everything I had been taught, I set the candle down and stepped closer to the coffin. The wood gleamed under the weak flame, polished and heavy, sealed with brass clasps. I hesitated, remembering Rule 6, but the silence stretched too long, and the guilt pressed harder. What if he was suffocating in there? What if he was clawing at the inside, begging someone to hear him? My hands moved before I could stop them. The clasps were cold under my fingers, stiff but not locked. I lifted one, then the other, my breath sharp and quick. As I pressed my palm against the lid, I felt a vibration, like something shifting inside, waiting for release. I lifted the lid just a crack, enough for a sliver of air to slip through. The smell hit me first, thick and sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Then came the sound, a rasping breath that didn't belong to any living thing. I slammed the lid shut instinctively, heart hammering, bile rising in my throat. But before the clasps clicked back into place, something pressed from the inside, fingers, cold and soft, dragging along the wood, as though reluctant to let me go. I stumbled back, knocking over the candle, sending wax spilling across the floor. I don't remember leaving the room, only that I woke hours later in my bed, drenched in sweat. My father stood over me, lantern in hand, his expression grim. He didn't ask if I had opened the coffin, he already knew. He only said, "You're lucky you didn't lift it farther. Lucky it didn't get the chance." His voice shook on the last word, and I had never heard fear like that from him before. That was when I realized Rule 6 wasn't just about respect. It was about keeping something inside. The next morning, the coffin was gone. My father said the family had come early to collect it, but I never saw them, and no carriage left the house. For weeks afterward, I swore I heard faint scratching in the walls at night, soft and patient, like something searching for the seam it had once been freed from. My brother laughed when I told him, but I noticed the way his eyes darted toward the viewing room door, the way his hand trembled when he held the lantern too close to it. He never teased me again after that. Years later, when I was trusted to prepare bodies on my own, I found myself staring at each coffin before dusk, making sure they were sealed tightly, clasps locked firm. Sometimes, when I was alone in the embalming room, I thought I heard a muffled cough or a low murmur, but I forced myself to walk away. Curiosity nearly destroyed me once. I couldn't let it again. But even as I turned away, I knew the rules were more than superstition. The dead in this place didn't always stay still, and sometimes the coffin was the only barrier keeping them quiet. 2 nights ago, that barrier was tested again. A storm swept through the mountains, knocking out power. The house plunged into shadow, lanterns flickering weakly in the halls. That was when I heard it, a coffin creaking open in the viewing room, followed by the unmistakable sound of something stepping onto the wooden floor. I didn't go down. I didn't even breathe. I sat in my room, clutching the lantern, listening to slow dragging movements below me, pacing, waiting. By dawn, it was quiet again. When I finally gathered the courage to check, the coffin was shut, clasps locked tight, as if untouched. I haven't told my father yet. Maybe he already knows. Maybe he was the one who shut it before I woke. Or maybe whatever was inside didn't need help closing it again. All I know is that the sound of those dragging steps still echoes in my mind, and I can't stop wondering if it's waiting for another chance. One mistake nearly let it out. The next mistake might mean none of us survive. And the bells that tolled last night, they sounded closer than ever, like they were ringing for something newly awake in the dark. I used to think names were harmless, just words we used to call someone. That changed the night. My father reminded me of Rule 7. Never speak the dead's names aloud. He didn't shout it, didn't sound like he was angry. He just looked at me with a sharpness that made the hairs on my neck stand up. In our funeral home, names are power. They're more than labels. They tether what lies beyond the veil to the world of the living. Speak one aloud, and you invite attention you cannot control. I learned the danger firsthand during a routine evening. I was arranging a display of flowers around a recently received coffin, a young woman who had died in the mountains under circumstances too grim to ignore. I had only meant to whisper her name just once to check my notes, but the moment it slipped from my lips, the air shifted. The lanterns flickered violently, casting jagged shadows across the room. A chill pressed down on my shoulders, and I could hear soft whispers, indistinct at first, but growing louder. Her name seemed to hang in the air, vibrating like a chord that shouldn't exist. The whispers became murmurs, circling me like the wind in a canyon, slow and deliberate. I froze, staring at the coffin, and then saw it, the slight movement of her hand beneath the draped sheet. I hadn't touched her, hadn't even leaned close. Yet she shifted as though aware that her name had been spoken, aware that someone dared to call her. I stumbled backward, knocking over a vase of lilies, their petals scattering across the polished floor. My father appeared immediately, lantern in hand, silent until the moment he saw the chaos. "I warned you," he said quietly, voice heavy. "Never speak them. Never." After that night, I began to notice subtle changes around the funeral home. Chairs seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking. Mirrors that I had previously covered carefully, for Rule 2 caught movement at the edges, and the whispers didn't stop. They simply hid, waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard someone repeating the name I had spoken, just beneath my window or down the long hallway. The sound was faint, distant, but deliberate, like a single thread pulling at the fabric of reality. My brother, always the skeptic, laughed at me when I told him. "It's just your imagination," he said, leaning against the parlor doorway, grinning as if he had no care in the world. "The dead don't care about names. You're letting the house scare you." But that night, he nearly learned the truth. I heard him mutter one of the recently arrived deceased's names while helping prepare a coffin, thinking I wasn't paying attention, and that was when the floor beneath him groaned, a long, low sound like the house itself warning him. His eyes went wide, and he froze mid-step, realizing too late that Rule 7 was not idle superstition. The whispers intensified, rising into a chorus that rattled the windows. Shadows lengthened unnaturally along the walls, and I could feel the air grow thick, almost solid, pressing against my chest. The names once spoken seemed to call more than just attention. They called intent. I tried to steady my brother, to get him to repeat the rules aloud, but my own voice trembled. I grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the lanterns, the flickering light throwing grotesque shapes across our faces. But the house wasn't fooled. The shadows moved differently now, stretching toward us, crawling along the floor like black water. By the time my father returned, the air had grown unbearably cold. He didn't yell, he didn't scold. He merely looked at the room, taking in the scattered petals, the knocked-over candle, the terrified expressions of his children, and shook his head. "You invited it," he said simply. His lantern cast a steady, unyielding glow, and the shadows receded slightly, but the whispers lingered, faint, unrelenting. That night, I realized the dead remember names, and once spoken, a part of you is tied to their memory forever. Even now, months later, I hesitate to mention anyone's name in the house. Every whisper, every creak, every cold draft reminds me of what can happen. The house is patient, and it does not forgive quickly. Sometimes, I hear faint echoes of my own voice repeating names I never thought I'd recall, and each time, I feel a tug in my chest, subtle at first, then insistent, like invisible hands, pressing, coaxing me toward the coffins, toward the mirrors, toward the doors I must never open. The worst part is that the whispers never came from a single source. Sometimes they came from the kitchen, sometimes the hallway, sometimes the embalming room. Each time, it was as if the deceased were multiplying their presence in the air, reminding me that speaking their names aloud is like planting a seed. One careless whisper, one fleeting curiosity, and that seed grows into a thing that moves in the shadows. I could feel it watching, waiting, and I began to dread the evenings even more than the nights. Last week, a new family brought in a body, and my father left me in charge while he dealt with the paperwork. I prepared the room carefully, draped the mirrors, checked the lanterns, and for a moment, I felt the suffocating calm of obedience. Then, as I arranged flowers, I whispered her name under my breath, just to myself, just a thought voiced aloud, and immediately the air turned icy. The lanterns flickered, shadows surged like black waves across the walls, and the faintest touch grazed my shoulder. I jumped, nearly dropping the flowers, and realized I had made the same mistake all over again. I slammed the coffin closed, heart racing, and waited. The house settled, but the tension didn't lift. I could still feel it in the corners, in the very floor beneath me. My brother wasn't there that night, but I knew that if he had been, he might have spoken too. I understood then that Rule 7 wasn't just for me, it was for anyone who might cross the threshold of the house. Names are power, and the dead do not forgive those who misuse it. And now, as I sit writing this, I hear a faint murmur from the hall, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. A name, someone I know I never spoke aloud, yet it hovers in the air. I dare not move, I dare not call out. For every time a name is spoken, I know something listens, and once it listens, it never forgets. Fog isn't just weather in the Appalachian Mountains. It's a living thing. My father explained Rule 8. Never leave the house once the fog rolls in, as if it were obvious. But it wasn't to me at first. I thought he meant it for safety from treacherous cliffs or the freezing air. I thought it was common sense. I didn't realize until much later that the fog carries its own eyes, its own patience, and it remembers the scent and shape of every living thing it touches. Once you step into it, you become part of its collection, and the house can do little to protect you. The first time I truly understood was a late autumn evening. I had been checking the lanterns along the eastern porch when a thin haze crept through the trees. At first, it was no more than mist, curling at my feet like smoke from a dying fire. But as the minutes passed, it thickened, rolling across the yard, weaving between gravestones and bushes, swallowing everything in a muted gray. I felt my father's warning in my chest, an echo of dread that made me hesitate. Every instinct screamed to turn back inside. I watched, frozen, as the fog moved unnaturally, slower than wind should, deliberate in its advance. Shapes seemed to drift inside it, shadowy silhouettes at first, then faces, pale, hollow faces that weren't quite human, some smiling, some crying, all watching me. The fog didn't just move. It reached, stretching toward the porch as if curious, eager to pull me into its cold embrace. I shivered, gripping the railing like a lifeline, feeling that invisible tug, the sensation of being beckoned by something that wasn't alive, but wasn't dead either. I turned to retreat, only to see the front gate, a good 100 feet away, completely swallowed in gray. My footsteps felt heavier as I moved back, each step sinking into a damp silence that seemed almost audible. That's when I heard it, faint scratching at the windows, like fingernails tracing the glass. The fog pressed closer, curling tendrils around the corners of the house, slipping beneath doors and through cracks. I realized then that leaving wasn't a simple matter of walking through it. If the fog claimed you, it didn't let go, and the house couldn't always pull you back inside. My brother, of course, ignored the warning. He had never fully trusted the rules, and his curiosity was reckless. I saw him step outside, lantern swinging in his hand, laughing at my terrified protest. "It's just fog," he shouted, voice cracking against the chill. But the fog didn't respond like air. It thickened, pressing against him, twisting and curling at his ankles. His laughter faltered. His feet wouldn't move as they had. The lantern flame flickered wildly, struggling to hold back the gray mass. And then I saw it, the shadow in the fog, just a hint, not fully formed, reaching for him like smoke made solid. I ran to the door, trying to pull him back, but he resisted, insisting he could handle it. The fog pressed closer, curling around his legs, creeping higher until it was at his waist, cold and suffocating. He screamed when he felt something brush his cheek, something wet and coarse, like hair on skin. I shouted at him, my voice breaking as I yanked on his arm, but the fog tugged him in the other direction, insistent and patient. Every time I thought I had him, a tendril would curl around his ankle again, drawing him toward the unseen shapes within. By the time my father appeared with the lanterns, the fog had reached almost to the porch. He didn't hesitate. He swung the largest brass lantern in a wide arc, casting a protective glow around my brother and me. The fog recoiled at the light, its edges curling back like smoke blown by wind, but not entirely. It left a pressure in the air, a sensation that we were being measured, weighed, and noted. My father's voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. "Inside, now. You break Rule 8, you lose more than your way. You risk being claimed." We scrambled back through the threshold, slamming the door against the fog's advance. It hissed, or maybe it sighed. I couldn't tell which, but the pressure remained, thick in the rooms, moving along the floorboards like liquid shadow. I thought the danger had passed, but the fog lingered outside the windows, watching, waiting. My brother sat shaking, pale, and I realized with terror that we had all but brushed against something older than the mountains themselves, something patient, something that had tasted the living before. Since that night, I never go near the windows or porch when fog rolls in. I track it from the corners of the house, watching the mist curl and pulse around the graves and the woods. Sometimes I see movement within it, something standing taller than any human should, waiting for a mistake. And I know if even one of us leaves the house during fog, the rules we've clung to, every single one, might fail. The house can only protect us so far. The rest is up to the fog itself. Last night the fog returned heavier than ever. Lanterns flickered as I walked the halls, listening for the creak of the wind, or the faintest trace of whispering shapes. I saw nothing at first, but the temperature dropped sharply, and I felt it, a tug at my ankle, a brush of something cold along my arm. I froze, heart hammering, knowing that the fog had begun its slow, deliberate work again. The shadows in the corners seemed to lean closer, and every breath I took tasted faintly of damp earth and something older. I knew the night wasn't over. I checked the windows one final time before heading to bed. The fog had climbed halfway up the porch steps, curling at the edges as if trying to seep inside. I gripped the doorknob like a lifeline, feeling its chill through the wood, and whispered a prayer to the house itself. My father's rules echoed in my mind, Rule 8 foremost among them. I wouldn't move tonight, not even for the lanterns or the wind. I had learned the hard way that stepping into the fog was an invitation, and invitations in this house, I knew now, were never politely declined. Mirrors have always been a hazard in our house, but I never understood why, until my father finally gave the warning. I couldn't ignore Rule 9. Never trust the reflections. At first I thought it was metaphorical, a warning about vanity or distraction. I was wrong. The reflections in this house are not mere images. They are active, aware, and patient. They copy what you do, but not always exactly. Sometimes they wait, and sometimes they step out, trading places with what's real. One misstep can let them in. It started on a quiet night, with the lanterns casting their flickering glow along the long hallways. I was alone, inspecting the embalming room for any lingering traces of past disturbances, and I caught movement in the old mirror by the stairs. At first I thought it was my own shadow, But then I saw it. The reflection lagged behind, slightly delayed, its head tilting in a way mine hadn't. I froze, realizing the mirror wasn't merely reflecting me, it was watching me. My chest tightened as I recalled every previous rule. Rule 9 wasn't just a warning, it was a survival guideline, like the others, and I had ignored it. I tried to turn away, but the reflection persisted, shifting subtly. Its eyes glimmered unnaturally, fixated on me, as if calculating, waiting for the moment I faltered. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, matching the subtle creaks of the house. Lantern light trembled along the walls, casting shadows that seemed to stretch toward the mirror. I remembered Rule 4, Rule 5, and Rule 8, the lanterns, the bells, the fog, all of it connected, converging in this moment of pure dread. The reflection wasn't passive, it was anticipating. The worst part was the whisper. It wasn't loud, but it came from the mirror itself, a hiss that mimicked my voice almost perfectly. "Come closer," it said. My hands shook as I gripped the nearest lantern, raising it toward the glass. The flame flickered violently, and the reflection smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of lips that had never existed on my real face. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the step, realizing that what I was looking at wasn't me at all. It was something that had learned to imitate, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. I ran through the hallway, away from the mirrors, but the reflections followed. Every polished surface showed me a version of myself, lagging just behind, twitching in ways my body did not. I reached the parlor and slammed the door, breathing hard, lantern held high. My brother's voice echoed from behind me, nervous, almost panicked, warning me to stay calm. But I knew it wasn't him. I hadn't called him, yet the mirror-like surfaces reflected his face, urging me to turn, to look, to step closer. That was the danger. The reflections tempt, promising recognition and familiarity, but they lie. I remembered what my father always said: mirrors are doors in this house. They don't just show, they trap. If a reflection sees you, it can study you, mimic you, and eventually replace you. Every mistake we had made, the extinguished lanterns, the spoken names, following the bells, stepping into the fog, had prepared us for this confrontation. But none of that mattered if I faltered here. I had to ignore the reflection, and yet, ignoring it made it press harder, filling my mind with phantom movements, phantom whispers, faint brushings along my shoulder. Then the fog began to seep in again, curling at the edges of the parlor, pressing cold and damp against the wood. I realized with terror that all the rules were connected: the fog, the bells, the lanterns, the dead, the reflections. They were part of a single patient force. It watched, waited, and measured us. The reflections, however, were the most dangerous, because they could step from the mirrored world into ours, if invited, even by accident. My brother, trembling beside me, muttered a name he shouldn't have, and I felt the connection tighten. The reflections noticed, and they remembered. I backed away toward the stairs, trying to keep the lantern between myself and the nearest mirror. My father's voice echoed in my mind, warnings of Rule 1 through Rule 9, each one now vital. I could hear the faintest dragging sounds, the rustling of unseen feet across the floor, the whispers that had followed us from the coffins, and through the fog, all converging at the mirrors. One step too close, one glance too long, and the reflection might decide it was time to step out. I knew instinctively that the house would protect me only so far. Beyond that, it was on my own. Suddenly I felt a hand brush my arm, not real, but precise enough to make me stumble. I swung the lantern, light cutting across the mirrors, and saw a flash, my reflection, or what should have been mine, smiling from a polished surface in the far corner. I stumbled backward again, shouting warnings at my brother to stay away from the glass, but the reflections multiplied, each one a distorted echo, whispering, urging, mocking. The house seemed alive, watching us, feeding on our fear, patient as ever. I reached the main hallway, lantern held high, and tried to recall the first rule my father taught: Always respect the house. Always obey the rules. The reflections lingered behind every pane of glass, every polished surface, some even in framed photographs. I realized that ignoring them wasn't enough. They must be actively avoided, denied any chance to observe, to learn, to lure. My brother cowered behind me, and I could see panic in his eyes, mirroring my own. One mistake now would be fatal. Then the lights flickered. Lanterns along the hallway danced, shadows twisting as if laughing at our fear. I felt the tug of the fog and remembered the bell's faint tolling from earlier that night, as if all of the house's rules were converging for this moment. The reflections pressed closer through the glass, leaning toward us, waiting, coaxing. I realized I had to act, or the mirrored forms would step through. My hand shook, my lantern trembled, but I stood my ground, staring straight ahead, refusing to let my eyes wander to the glass. The night stretched on, the house alive with silent movement, whispers, and the threat of mirrored shapes stepping out. My father's warnings echoed in my mind, each rule now a lifeline: lanterns, coffins, bells, fog, names, shadows, reflections. I didn't speak, didn't look, didn't move more than I had to. The fog pressed at the door, the whispers pressed at the walls, the reflections pressed at every polished surface, but I held steady. Somewhere deep in the house, the rules were watching too, patient, waiting for me to fail. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen and trembling, watching for movement that wasn't supposed to exist. Eventually, dawn came, gray and cold, and the lanterns settled into their steady glow. The fog receded, the mirrors returned to normal, and the whispers faded into nothingness, leaving only the faintest echo in the corners of my mind. But I knew the danger wasn't gone. The reflections are patient, they are always patient, and one day, when I least expect it, they will try again. If you enjoyed this story, like, share and subscribe for more.